Well, leaders, welcome back as we jump into lesson 6, the second half of chapter 4. We're excited to be with you guys and excited to jump in. If you guys are looking at your group discussion guide on page 72, Carolyn and I wanted to kind of begin by drawing your attention to one of the questions that we ask in the Why Are We Here section. We ask the question, what would happen if we just focused on one of these connect, grow, and engage? Some of y'all may have heard Carolyn do this before. I've been in many staff meetings with you. I've been in many Bible study training meetings with you. And one of your go-to phrases is start with the why.
Yeah.
And so it's great at the beginning of the semester to start with the why, reminding people why we're doing what we're doing. But we also thought, particularly in this lesson, halfway through kind of the semester, to kind of remind people ultimately, what are our goals? Why are we in Bible study? Why are we running through this packet and going through Ephesians? And so particularly, we often talk about 3 main goals for our small groups, our Bible studies, our community groups. And those are that we would be able to connect, grow, and engage. Connect, that we're getting connect in community with one another, connect with the Lord. Grow, that we're getting to grow in our relationship with the Lord, not just Bible study skills, but also with our own relationship with the Lord. And then lastly, engage, that we're trying to engage our faith into the community, sharing our faith, making a practical impact in the community that the Lord has put us in. And so we think it's really helpful to not gloss right over that, but as you're jumping into this particular lesson, spending a little bit of time thinking through, if our group was only doing one of these, then what would we be, or what's missing? So, if we were just simply connecting, then we're nothing more than a potluck dinner club, hopefully with some good food. If all we were doing was growing, then we're nothing more than a lecture in a classroom. Or if all we were doing was engaging, then ultimately we're doing a lot of good, but we're not necessarily maybe growing or even connecting with anyone along the way. And so particularly what we're trying to make sure happens for you guys as leaders, as you think about your groups and how you're leading, is, are you getting these 3 kind of pieces, emphases, all mixed in and kind of calibrated along the semester so that each of those is happening in some form or fashion?
Yeah, so good. And that might be just a great conversation to actually have at this point in the semester with your group. If they already know connect, grow, and engage, just throw that question out there. What would happen if we only did 1 or 2 of these? I think you get some really good answers and a good discussion based on that.
Love it.
All right, well, let's get started then with the second half of chapter 4. One of the things we thought we'd do is just kind of highlight maybe a flow of thought that we saw in the next couple of sections in Ephesians. So if last week in the first half of chapter 4, it was kind of focusing on, once again, who we are, the unity that we have now as a new humanity, a new body of believers in Christ. And so then as we progress through the next sections, the second half of chapter 4, which is what we're going to do this week, and then the first 2 sections of chapter 5 actually highlight 3 contrasts to that unity. So in the second half of chapter 4, we see a contrast of the old and the new man, or the new humanity. In 5, the first half of 5, we see a contrast between dark and light. And then in the second half of 5, beginning of 6, we see the foolish and the wise. So Paul is laying out all these situations, all these instructions and commands, but those contrasts are kind of the heartbeat behind them. And I think actually help people to kind of grasp where he's going.
I love that. And so it kind of, as you guys jump in to observations and kind of get a sense of that flow of thought, it kind of helps kind of us zero in to kind of what do we see this week in lesson 6. So here in the second half of chapter 4, as I was kind of doing my observations, had my pen out, I remembered our discussions last week about walk, that walk was this key verb, this key word. And so there I am, I'm on the first line in the packet, and I notice walk and I circle it. And then I just kind of, knowing some of the questions that were coming, I began to kind of circle every word that seemed like walk. And so before I knew it, I had circled behavior, I had circled practice, I had circled way of life. Eventually I circled righteousness, purity, and holiness, and kind of got all these words that seem to kind of denote, again, conduct, or kind of how do I live, how am I walking? And then I was kind of going along further, and I noticed there was a lot of words that also weren't about kind of practical, what am I doing, but were about kind of mindset. And so I ended up boxing the words minds, understanding, ignorance, learn, heard, taught, truth multiple times. And so I kind of noticed, man, there's a lot of words that have something to do with how I'm living. There's also a lot of words that kind of have to note something about how I'm thinking. And then lastly, and maybe not as is a little bit more subtle, but I noticed some words that kind of denoted kind of how I feel or my motivations. And so I noticed the word greediness. I noticed the word heart. I noticed the word lust that was there in 22. And so as we kind of jumped into question one on the observation area, what keywords do you notice? For me, I kind of quickly, doing all that kind of work, notice there's kind of this emphasis in the sense of hands, head, and heart, or in a sense of what am I thinking, how am I feeling, and what am I doing. That was a huge piece in the first half of this passage that I noticed how Paul was kind of talking through it. What else did you see?
Yeah, totally. Also felt like there were some callbacks, even in this question, to things earlier in the book, especially Paul's prayers. I noticed when he was bringing up, kind of the mindset and the truth and those things. I remembered some of his prayers in chapter 1 about, the spirit of wisdom and knowledge and revelation that he was praying that people would have, that the eyes of their minds would be full of understanding. So yeah, I noticed some of those things too.
I love it. I liked question 3. You'll notice a bunch of commands here in the second half of this passage. And so if you want to, I underline each of the commands, kind of help find them. And then I was thinking through, how do these fit together? What's the theme between kind of undergirding or tying them all together? And at least for me, kind of a couple words I came up with were, I felt like we're emphasizing again the unity of this community, that we're to be kind to one another, we're to love one another, we're to forgive one another, we're to speak truth. We're not to be angry with one another, that we're trying to maintain that unity of those relationships, that community. But then also the other word I thought through here, thinking about how the Gentiles once lived, but how we're to live now, that there was a sense of not just unity, like we're all supposed to be together, but a sense of purity, that we're also supposed to look different than the rest of the world. And so those ideas of unity, I thought, were kind of beginning in the previous passage, continuing in this passage, but then I thought the new theme of purity that was kind of emerging, that we ought to look different, we ought to sound different, we ought to walk different than we had prior and than the Gentiles do today.
Yeah. So did you think that there was one idea or thought that connected anything here? Or was it that unity and purity was kind of your...
Those two things were kind of what I kept grabbing hold of.
Yeah. I kind of felt like, hopefully you won't think that there's just one right answer to this, that this is more of a question to kind of get people thinking again about the flow of thought. So be open to different ideas that people have in your group. That's part of the beauty of coming together. Even when Trey and I get together beforehand to talk about it, I'm like, yeah, that's good. That's a good way to see it. And that's the beauty of studying together.
Totally agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's turn the page over to our interpretation section now. And that first question there, whether or not we saw a progression in the first part, verses 17 through 19. Trey kind of came up exactly what I was thinking about this, the head, heart, and hands. And actually thinking that maybe in the past we might have concentrate, what you think then causes you to feel and then causes you to do. But I actually believe what Paul's saying here is more of this idea that we're an integrated whole, and each piece, our head, our heart, and our hands, influences the thoughts, the feelings, and the actions of the other pieces. Even going so far as to say in verse, where was that? 18, saying because of the hardness of your heart. So maybe even thinking that the motivation of the heart is actually a driver behind all the other things.
Which I think for us is really interesting, being a Bible church in a university town. I think we have such an emphasis sometimes on the mind. Yeah. And so let's teach the mind and then everything will be fine. Everything will correct itself. And I think thinking through this I think sometimes we bypass kind of the heartbeat as to where a lot of movement happens and a lot of change happens. And so trying to think through that and making sure we don't kind of overlook that too quickly. Question 2 kind of gets into this idea of the old man versus the new man. And so if you remember in chapter 2 of Ephesians, we talked about kind of the new man, this new community in which Jew and Gentile are put together, rivalries and things that were in the past kind of washed out, and this new community emerges that is under and in Christ. Well, that kind of terminology is going to resurface again here in chapter 4. And so in question 2, we're asking you about the old man. We're asking you about the new man, referencing back to Romans, Colossians, also Ephesians, 2 Corinthians, and each of these. And so what is the old man? What is the new man? How do we understand them? We tried to ask you, is it referring to an individual person or is it referring to a group of people? Just a little clue for you. If we ever ask you an either or question, the answer is typically it's a both and. So for us, even as we were looking at it, we kind of thought there isn't a real emphasis on the personal here, that the individual has a choice to make as to how they see themselves and how they're going to choose to act. But the individual is not in isolation, because as the individual is thinking about who they once were and now who they are now within a broader community, and that community has implications for how they live. And so as I was looking at kind of the old man, kind of the way I phrased it or tried to define it, and again, I'm going to use maybe a modern day word, but it's almost that old identity of who I once was, my background, my priorities, my lifestyle, my community. Is the old man. That old man has been put to death. That in Christ, that I've suffered a death. That now, as Paul was saying in 2 Corinthians 5:17, the new creation has come. The old things have passed, and that new man is in a sense a new identity. It's who I now am after trust in Jesus Christ, and now post Christ, post cross. I have a new identity. I'm part of a new community, and with that comes implications of a new lifestyle. And so I think Paul is talking here in a real positional sense of who I am positionally, that's going to have implications for who I ought to be practically, and that he's going to call us to and how we live. But ultimately, I think what we're seeing here is this sense of who we once were and who we now are.
Yeah, so good. And I love how Colossians is really like a mirror, says it in a slightly different way, very similar. So reading those in your group can be really helpful as well. All right, so question 3 then is another one of those therefore questions. So what's the significance of the therefore in verse 25? And then how do the truths of the previous section relate to the relational commands? So again, identity and who we are informs what we do. And I think that this would be, if you haven't already had a chance to go over some of the specifics of the commands, walking through each one of those, thinking of how they are very relational, having to do with speech and just what we're doing with our hands, all the things that in a group setting are really important. A follow-up question that I thought of that might be good for this are, what would motivate the Ephesians or even us to slip back into behaving out of our old man and our old identity? So the passage kind of alludes to some of that. We want what is good, so maybe we think stealing might be the way to find it. So what is the motivation that would cause us to slip back into our old man? I think that could be a really great discussion.
Love that. Questions 4 and 5 kind of hit on, as you look at all the commands that come in the second half of the section, verses 25 to 32, looking at those commands, the question kind of comes, well, what does it mean to grieve the Spirit if I'm not obeying these commands? Or question 5, what opportunity does the devil really end up having if I don't obey these commands? For me, I kind of tied those two questions together because I think the answer is similar to both of them. That if I'm not obeying these commands, then ultimately what's at stake is both the unity of this new community, again, and the purity of this community. That the Spirit is grieved when the unity of the community is threatened. The Spirit is grieved when the purity of the community is tainted. Similarly speaking, those are the very opportunities the devil is wanting. And so the very things that grieve the Spirit are the very opportunities the devil's trying to seize. And so I think you see those working kind of in contrast together.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so then that takes us to application, and these two questions really do flow directly out of the interpretation. So the first one here is just, kind of identifying that this new humanity is our present reality. And so is Paul saying, really, should we act how we really are or become someone different? And of course, we would say that we need to act out of who we really are. A follow-up question I thought of here as well, I kind of like making up follow-up questions, don't I? Is maybe it might take it to the next level with the discussion by saying, have you noticed God's Spirit really prompting you in any specific area of your life where you might be slipping back into old practices, your default setting of your old man? This is where you as a leader can really lead out in vulnerability, go first and say, in this area, whether it's, maybe something in your own heart and mind or in some close relationships that you have, I find myself slipping back into this pattern and not really living out of my true identity and my new self. So that might be a way to take that question a little bit further.
I think especially the second half of the book of Ephesians, there's just so much practical commands, ideas, situations that it becomes easy to kind of think through those things and kind of go, hey, is there a specific area for me where I'm struggling, or did one of these commands kind of trigger that hit a little harder? Let's move along, The second question here in the application section, we're trying to kind of trigger, are there relationships in which that unity that's meant to be preserved has been fractured and broken? And if so, that's a big deal, and to not just let it linger. And so wanting to encourage and creating a moment in your groups, we're asking people, hey, is there a relationship where a wrong has been either experienced or done that either you need to ask forgiveness or that you need to initiate to seek forgiveness and to seek a unity and a reconciliation? That those kinds of brokenness is something that we want to see remedied. We want to see people courageously move towards that. That ultimately, if we can't learn to ask for forgiveness, if we can't reconcile and forgive, ultimately that community and that unity is going to be threatened and ultimately impossible without those kind of tendencies. So we want to create a moment for people to kind of wrestle with, hey, is that something I'm wrestling through? Is there a relationship I need to kind of to address and resolve?
Yeah, so good. And of course that, the reputation of us as believers and as the body of Christ, when there's conflict and, division, causes people to wonder, what's the difference between them and us? So, that kind of takes us to our Engage tool again. Sharing our story is the same one that we had last week. And Trey, you had some ideas about maybe taking this one further as well.
Yeah, I think, we started even the video talking about connect, grow, engage. And I think one of the things we find through the years is people's first reason why they sign up for a Bible study is to connect. Yeah. So getting people to connect or prioritizing that, usually not a problem. Even for you guys as leaders with icebreakers, sometimes it's like, hey, let's make sure that's not 45 minutes. Let's do some other things. And then typically even growing, people who have wanted to jump into a Bible study, they could have connected in a lot of spaces, but they've chosen to connect in a Bible study because they want to grow. They want to learn more about the Bible. They want to grow in their relationship with the Lord. And so then over the last few years, as we've written on a lot of these kind of disciple-making skills, what we're trying to do is help equip you as leaders and equip your group to begin to be an influence for Jesus Christ, helping people find and follow Jesus. And so these skills are all in that mode. But what I've found through the years is that particular emphasis and thrust to engage is usually one of the hardest for people. And I think like most things that are hard for us, we typically need community to do them well. And so the things that come natural and easy, I don't need accountability. I don't need encouragement. I don't need other people coming alongside. But the things that are hard are the things I need to do together with others. And so one of the things we want to encourage you guys today is thinking through these engaged skills, not as individual skills that people try all by themselves in isolation, but you guys would begin to think of these almost as a team sports skill. So what would it look like for us as a group to share our story? And so maybe it's not that someone needs to invite a neighbor or a coworker out to lunch one-on-one, but maybe there's an opportunity over the next few weeks, next month or so, to a special event or some kind of opportunity to gather multiple people in your group, maybe the very people that you guys have been praying for throughout the semester, to say, hey, let's have a dinner party. Let's watch a game together. Let's watch a show together, and let's have a chance to connect, and someone can share their story and we can have some spiritual conversations. And so one of the things we want you guys to think through these skills is that it's not just a individual skill that they do in isolation by themselves, but that you begin to think of these as group skills. How do we do this as a team sport? What could that look like?
Yeah, so good, so good. All right, well, that's all we have for you this week, and we are praying for you, and thank you.
See you guys.